I don't understand it either, but it's cool. Hey, good morning. Welcome. These weeks, we've been learning lessons about how to family. I mean, family is a verb, right? How to do family from the life of King David from the Old Testament. So he was this great king. He was a great leader. He was given the nickname, a man after God's own heart. He did so many things right, but one big deficit of his was family. He was largely an unengaged, passive dad. He didn't know how to discipline. He was scared to discipline. He had some issues with lack of disciplining of his kids. And as we're going to look today, he had some issues with how to deal with family division. Now, whether you're married, whether you have kids, but if you're basically an adult, you understand family division. Some division is temporary. You might have just a little spat with a sibling or a parent or an adult child, and the division lasts about 10 minutes. And then you say sorry and give a hug and you're back. But that's temporary division. Then there's long-term division, where there's a divide in the family between you and an uncle, two cousins, two brothers, a mother and a son-in-law, whatever it is, that can last for decades. Now, there's several categories of division. One would be like a political division in your family. So you got a really conservative Republican and a really liberal Democrat, and it's Thanksgiving. And it's not so Thanksgiving-ish, right? And it starts out with just some humorous jabs and, oh, what about this and what? But over time, there are some harsh words said, and the next thing you know, there's a divide between the family politically, and they don't speak to each other for years. Sometimes the divide is theological. So maybe your parents, you are parents, or you're adults, and you are committed Christians, and you've got a sibling or some kids who are making lifestyle choices that you don't like, that you know are wrong, and you're walking that tightrope because you want to welcome them and be nice, and you want Thanksgiving to be okay, but everyone knows that something's not right, and there's a divide between you and a sibling, or between you and the kids or your parents because of a moral issue, right? Sometimes the divide is just chemistry. I mean, it's just like, I don't know, I don't want to go all stereotypical on you, but the mother-in-law with the daughter-in-law, right? And they would never be friends, except that they have to be together because of marriage. And so there's all kinds of reasons for divide, and we're going to unpack this from the life of David. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 13 and 14, if you want to kind of tag along in that. But every divide starts with some event, okay? Something happens to cause the divide. For King David and his son Absalom, it was a significant divide, one that I doubt any of us have experienced. But Absalom, son number 3, killed his brother Amnon, son number 1, in revenge because Amnon had sexually assaulted his half-sister Tamar. Now, that's not your typical family divide, right? But this was the divide. And when this event happened, it kicked into gear this family division. Now, after the event, and it might be a series of events that divide you and your brother-in-law. It might be a series of events or a single event. But there is something that precipitates the family divide, the tension. Then comes the response. Now, when Absalom got into this argument and trapped Amnon and killed him, his response was, ruh-roh. Like, he knows right away that his family isn't going to rally behind him. And so his response is to flee. Have you heard the fight or flight term? That when there's an event, a conflict, you fight or flight. And Absalom did the flight thing. He actually fled, literally, 100 miles north to Geshur. And he would end up being in Geshur for 3 years. King David's response was, of course, anger, and he banned Absalom from returning to Jerusalem. So David responded by saying, "You can't come home, boy." And Absalom said, "Well, I'm out of here because I don't want to get killed by somebody else." This was their response. 2 Samuel 13, verse 37 to 39 is very interesting. Samuel, the prophet, wrote this story. He recorded it, 1 and 2 Samuel. And he recorded this response in 2 different pairs. That's what I'm calling them. And in pair number 1, it says, "Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur." Now that means nothing to you except this. This was his grandfather. He went to Grandpa. It was a reasonably safe place. Politically, they would negotiate between countries in those days, and so Geshur and Israel had a negotiation, and they decided the king of Geshur, he's going to give his daughter to King David, kind of as a treaty, okay? And out of them comes Absalom. And so Absalom flees to his grandfather's house, palace, 100 miles north. So Absalom flees. Then sentence 2. "And David mourned for his son Amnon every day." So the response was Absalom fled, David mourned. Okay? Then pair number 2. Absalom had fled. He repeats it. Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur where he stayed for 3 years. And then the second part of the second pair. David longed to go to Absalom. Did you catch that? David longed to go to Absalom, for David had finished grieving over Amnon's death. So with that finished grieving thing, don't think he was no longer sad that his number 1 son was dead, killed at the hands of number 3 son. It wasn't that he was no longer sad, that he was beginning to heal. He was beginning to cope better. He was beginning to move on, as they say. But now he actually began to long for the son that had killed his firstborn. And you need to hear this. When there's an event that divides people in a family, out of that response is a lot of murkiness, conflicted feelings, shifting feelings. So David, there was nothing in him that wanted to see Absalom. He was still mad as, right? That Absalom had killed his oldest son. But there was a part of him that wanted to be with Absalom. You see, that's what happens in family. We have conflicted relations. We love them and we hate them. We want them to be with us, but we can't stand it when they're with us. And David was in this murkiness in his response. Absalom fled, and he mourned Amnon. He's beginning to heal after 3 years, and he begins to long for Absalom, but he doesn't want to be with Absalom. Okay? There's an event, and then there's some kind of response that we have to the event, good or bad. But then comes the mediator. Often when there's family division, you need a friend or a third party or a counselor or something to help bridge the divide. Mediator. Back to our story. 2 Samuel 14, verse 1 says, "Joab, son of Zeruiah, observed that the king's mind was on Absalom." So Joab was the nephew of the king, relative, and he was a general in his army. And so he's hanging around King David. It's been 3 years, and David hasn't spoken to or seen his son Absalom. His heels are dug in. He says, "You're not coming back to Jerusalem. Yes, I miss you. I want you, but I can't have you here. I'm not ready." And Joab, in conversations with King David, picked up that David's heart was turning toward. And maybe King David had said on a particular day, "Man, I wonder what Absalom's doing right now." Or maybe he looked sullen, and Joab sees him and says, "King David, what's on your mind?" And King David, "Absalom. Absalom's on my mind." And so Joab is watching what's happening, and he knows that King David needs a little push on this family reconciliation. But Joab doesn't think he's the right guy for that. Have you ever been there? Like you see a family conflict, and you say, someone needs to step in and help to mediate. But then you say, but that's not me. And sometimes it shouldn't be you. But this is where Joab was, right? He says, I know something needs to happen, but no, it's not me. And so he came up with a plan. And have you, I know many of you have, you've orchestrated plans in the back room, right? To try to, hey, can you just like slip it in a conversation? You know, we orchestrate plans. So Joab is trying to mediate by orchestrating a plan. And what he does is he contacts a clever woman from Tekoa. Yes, you heard that. A clever woman from Tekoa. She goes unnamed other than that. Tekoa was 12 miles north of Jerusalem. I don't know how he knew this clever woman from Tekoa, but he's the general, sends one of his soldiers, go get the clever woman from Tekoa, brings her. He says, you need to go to King David. And here's what I want you to do. And he orchestrates this mediation. He says, go to King David, like put some tears on, like act like you're all sad. Put on widow's mourning clothes. And go tell him, and he gave the story to her. And so this woman from Tekoa shows up at the palace and somehow manages to get in and a hearing with King David. And she's all sad. She's playing the part. She says, I'm a widow, and my husband died, and I have 2 sons, and they were fighting, and one killed the other son, and now the family's all in an uproar, and some want him dead, like the one who killed the other one, want him dead, and yet as bad as what he did was, he's still precious to me. And King David hears this story, and he says, I'll protect your son. It'll be okay. I'll make sure that your family doesn't kill your son. And then she comes clean. She says, well, actually, I'm talking about you. Like, you got 2 sons. And they were fighting, and one killed the other one, and you need to reconcile with Absalom. Now, you know what this is like. Sometimes you try to mediate, and it just makes things worse, right? It just blows up. Now, David, fortunately, was a man after God's own heart, and he had a softness. And so he's looking at this lady. He doesn't get all wound up and fly off the handle, but he's starting to connect the dots. Like, why is this lady, what would spur her to do this? Like, why would she come and make up this story? And he asked her, so did Joab put you up to this? And she said, yes, sir, he did. It's all his idea. No, don't get it, And fortunately, David accepted it. After 5 years, he's saying, okay, I'm ready. So he calls for, after 3 years, he says, okay, I'm ready. So he calls Joab, and he says, Joab, I want you to go up to Geshur and bring Absalom home. Chapter 14, 2 Samuel, verse 23. So Joab got up, went to Geshur, and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. This is after 3 years. However, the king added in his instruction to Joab, Absalom may return to his house, but he may not see my face. So Absalom returned to his house, but he did not see the king. So 3 years stuck up there. The woman of Tekoa, mediator, David bites. He says, okay. He brings Absalom home, but he says, I will not see him. And that lasted for another 2 years. He did not speak to his son or see him for 5 years. Often, bridging a family divide takes place over a long period of time with small steps. And this is a small step where David says, I'll let him come home. He can move into his house, but he can't come into my house. Now, is there progress? Yes. Is there enough progress? No. Small steps, okay? But then 2 years pass, 5 years total. And Absalom has now been back for 2 years in Jerusalem, hasn't seen his father, not allowed to be in his presence. And it comes to a point where Absalom says, enough is enough. He says, I'm going to cut my losses. I'm not going to worry anymore about who I offend or what I do. You know, there's a point in reconciliation when many of us reach this, and we say, you know, if they get mad, they get mad, but it can't be worse than it currently is. So I'm just going to dive into this thing. And Absalom says, I've got to see the king. And if he kills me, he kills me. But I will not live like this any longer. So he has that line in the sand. Now, I'm going to read you some verses that I think are kind of funny, and I really don't understand them completely. But we are in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 28. Absalom resided in Jerusalem for 2 years, but never saw the king. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab was unwilling to come. So he sent for him again a second time, but he still wouldn't come. So here's the situation. Absalom says, enough is enough. I'm going to fix this myself. The woman from Tekoa can't do it. Joab can't do it. I just need to go see the king, and if he kills me, he kills me. But I can't just walk into the king's room. I have to go through Joab. So he called him once, texted him, no response. Texted him a second time, no response. Okay, verse 30. Then Absalom said to his servants, hey, Joab has a field right next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set fire to it. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. I think that's funny. Like, I would not recommend that. Okay? If you can't get your son-in-law to answer the phone call, don't go burn his house down. All right? But it worked. I don't know. It worked. So let's read on. Verse 31, then Joab came to Absalom's house and demanded, why did your servants set my field on fire? And Absalom said, because you didn't answer my text. So there, you know. He said, I sent for you and said, come here. I want to send you to the king to ask, why have you brought me back from Geshur? I'd be better if I were still up in Geshur. So now, Joab, I'm telling you, let me see the king. And if I'm guilty, let him kill me. But he says, enough is enough. I'm done with this broken relationship. Most of the time, reconciliation in a family requires multiple attempts, multiple mediation, multiple little steps. And sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. And sometimes you can't ever fix it. Reconciliation and bridging the family divide is just flat out hard. Okay? Well, Joab said, okay. And he went into the king and he says, Absalom's not backing down anymore. He says, if you're going to kill him, just kill him. But he wants to see you. Something's got to happen, King David. And King David agreed after 5 years of silence. Verse 33. So David summoned Absalom, who came to the king and bowed down with his face to the ground before him. Then the king kissed Absalom. And this statement of Absalom, this murderer, killed his older brother. This statement of him coming before the king and bowing down his face to the ground is his repentance. It's his apology. It's his I was wrong. And the cultural kiss on the cheek was King David's act of forgiveness. Now, that's the story. Reconciliation and bridging family tension and family divide is not just a 6-step process. You know this, right? Life is complicated, and what works here doesn't work here, and what works this time doesn't work the next time. But you would be hard-pressed to argue with this. There's always an event or events, something that happens that leads to a response. Good or bad, dig in your heels, flight or fight. There's always a response to the event. You could choose to let it go and forgive and not let that little crack become a fissure, like a big wide. But there's always an event and then a response. Then we come to this mediator, whether you try and jump in or you volunteer to jump in there, but there's a mediator. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can't argue that to heal a relationship overwhelmingly after the event and the response is mediation. Maybe there's progress, maybe there's a second swing at it, but this is just hard work. Now, I am not here to tell you how to fix your relationship with your brother that you haven't talked to in 35 years or whatever. I'm not here to say, how do you mend the relationship with your obnoxious father-in-law? How do you deal with your son-in-law who is so disrespectful to your daughter? But you invite both of them over for Thanksgiving, and it's just tense every time they're here because everyone knows that the son-in-law is kind of banned over to the corner. I mean, he sits there, but I don't have answers for what you should do to mend the family divide that you may be experiencing. But I have 3 wise words for you. Now listen carefully. Here's the first one. You do what you can. I mean, you do your part, right? You have about this much control over how your brother or your uncle or your cousin or your mother-in-law or your son, you have about this much control over them. But you have all the control you need over you. And what are you going to do? You're not going to stand before God someday and him ask you, hey, did you have any family division? Because that's like a yes for every one of the 7.5 billion people on the planet. Instead, he will ask, in your family division, did you start it? And if you didn't start it, regardless, what did you do to try to fix it? What did you do? Romans 12:18, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. If it is possible, it's not always possible. It takes 2 to dance, right? But if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace. Do your part. Okay? Here's a second wise word. Be humble enough to ask for help. You can sacrifice your relationship on the altar of your pride. Embarrassed about going to a counselor. Embarrassed about admitting that you started the whole mess in the beginning. Embarrassed. You can do that. Go ahead, and it'll lead you to a dark place. Or you can humble yourself and ask for help. Or you may even be a Joab who tries to step in. You may be the offended party or part of the division. You say, enough is enough. And you just have to eventually say, if they kill me, they kill me. But I cannot live with this division any longer. But do the mediation. Do your part. Get help. And then a third word. Remember that reconciliation is worth the fight. So, I have a family divide. Not my immediate family, but I have a family divide. It's now running at 35 years of division in our family. And I was telling Joan last week, coming up to this sermon, I said, oh man, I haven't even preached it. I'm already convicted. I can say that this family divide that's now 30 plus years, over the long haul, I've made effort, and I think I could stand before God, but I haven't talked to this family member in a year. And yesterday I called him. Didn't answer. I'll call again. But I was reminded once again, relationships and reconciliation are worth the fight. And I know that some of you are sitting at the bottom of a mountain and you look at a relationship in your family that you think is so broken over such a long term that you see no way out. And this side of heaven, we're not going to fix them all. But you do your part. You ask for help. And don't give up. It's worth the fight. It really is. Okay, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. In a moment, I'm going to ask everyone to kneel down. And some of you are thinking, if I kneel, I'll never get back up again. Well, hey, help, I've fallen. Okay, we'll come get you, okay? There is something powerful about kneeling before the Creator of heaven and earth and pleading for His grace and His mercy and His healing. And maybe you prayed 1,000 prayers before for some uncle. Maybe you're not even in but it's 2 other family members that are fighting. But we just need to kneel before God. And I'm going to give you a bit of time. You can whisper, you can mouth the words. If you don't kneel, I will not look at you with judgment. This is a judgment-free zone. I'm only asking you, would you please kneel before the Creator of heaven and earth and plead for His mercy over your family, over your friends' families, over the families of this church, over the divide, the division for so many of us. It's been so many years. And God, would you please do something? So let's kneel right now, and we're going to pray. So on your own, you can whisper, you can mouth the words, but plead for His mercy and His healing and His conviction. Some of you need to take a step. You need to make a phone call this afternoon. You need to send an email. Some of you need to apologize. Some of you need to step in as a mediator, but plead for God's mercy. Father, we kneel before you, Creator of heaven and earth, and we do plead for your mercy. These divisions, most of the time, are far bigger than us. We have no answers. We don't know what to do. We've tried 100 things and nothing's worked, or maybe we haven't tried at all, but we plead for your mercy. Give us the courage to apologize, to take the first step, to do what we can to ask for help. Help us to remember that relationships matter. Reconciliation is worth the fight. And I plead for you on behalf of the families of this church, the families of this city and this state and this nation, our world. Please, Father, let Christians be a beacon of light and an example of what it looks like to live in brokenness and work for restoration. Thank you for the lessons we can learn from a man like King David in all of his brokenness, and thank you that by your mercy and grace you healed his family, at least for that moment, and for that we're grateful. And please, would you do the same for us? In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much.